In 2014, researchers at the University of Virginia gave people a choice. Sit alone in a room with nothing but your own thoughts for 15 minutes, or give yourself an electric shock. 67% of men and 25% of women shocked themselves rather than sit in silence. They preferred literal pain over their own company, but there is a subset of people who would have sat in that room and felt nothing but relief. People whose brains actually produce reward chemicals during solitude. People who hear the words, "You will be alone tonight," and feel their shoulders physically drop. Not with disappointment, with something close to gratitude. The psychology behind why they are wired this way has almost nothing to do with introversion and almost nothing to do with personality type. It runs deeper than that. It lives in the actual architecture of the brain, shaped by experiences that started long before they could name what they were feeling. And if you have ever wondered why you seem to carry a quiet calm that others spend their entire lives chasing through relationships, through noise, through endless distraction, then what comes next might finally explain the thing about yourself you have never been able to put into words. There is a reason the word loner carries a sting. Western culture has spent decades reinforcing one single narrative about human connection, that needing people is healthy and not needing them is a warning sign. Therapists will ask about your social life within the first 5 minutes. Wellness articles will tell you to reach out, as though connection is always medicine and solitude is always the disease. The entire infrastructure of modern psychology, at least the popular version of it, assumes that spending too much time alone means something needs fixing. But that narrative is built on a confusion. A conflation of two experiences that look similar from the outside, but function in completely opposite ways inside the brain. John Cacioppo spent 30 years studying social isolation at the University of Chicago before his death in 2018. His definition of loneliness was precise, and it was different from what you might expect. Loneliness, he argued, is not the absence of people. It is the perceived discrepancy between the social connection you want and the social connection you actually have. You can feel it in a crowd of thousands. You can feel it lying beside someone you love. It has nothing to do with how many human beings are physically within reach of you. Now compare that to what the developmental psychologist Donald Winnicott described in 1958, when he wrote about something he called the capacity to be alone. Winnicott was not a self-help writer. He was a British psychoanalyst working with children and families. And his conclusion was clinical. The ability to be comfortably alone, he said, is one of the most important signs of emotional maturity in human development. That distinction is where everything turns, because it means the people who do not experience loneliness have developed something the field considers a genuine strength, not numbness, not denial about deeper pain, a capacity that Winnicott considered the hallmark of a well-integrated inner life. And once you understand this, you start to see how the cultural narrative has been running the wrong direction. We have built an entire social infrastructure around the assumption that connection is the cure for everything. Feeling down, call a friend, struggling at work, join a team, going through a breakup, surround yourself with people. And that advice works for those whose pain actually stems from insufficient connection. But for the person who already has a rich internal world, that same advice can feel like handing someone a glass of water when they are already standing in a lake. They are not thirsty. They never were. They just got tired of explaining that to people holding pitchers. They have something inside them that other people keep searching for externally, in friendships that drain more than they restore, in relationships that consume rather than complement, In social obligations, they say yes to out of fear rather than genuine desire. But what is that something, specifically? What does the neuroscience actually show when these people sit in silence and their brain does not scream for company? When you sit alone with no task, no conversation, no external stimulation, your brain does not go idle. It activates a specific network of regions that neuroscientists call the default mode network. This is a collection of brain structures, primarily the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus, that fire together whenever you are not focused on the external world. Marcus Rachel at Washington University in St. Louis first identified this network in 2001, and his initial discovery confused the field because the assumption had always been that when your brain is not doing a task, it is resting. What Rachel found was the opposite. Your brain already consumes about 20% of your body's total energy, and even when you think you are doing nothing, the default mode network keeps burning through that fuel at nearly the same rate as when you are actively focused. It does not power down. It redirects inward. It processes autobiographical memories. It constructs your sense of self. It runs simulations of possible futures. It makes meaning from past experience. It pieces together the narrative of who you are. For individuals who thrive in solitude, this network runs rich and deep. Their inner world is not empty space that needs filling with conversation or noise. It is a landscape they know well, dense with thought, textured with reflection, and deeply satisfying to inhabit hour after hour. However, the difference goes beyond just having an active imagination. Research by Robert Copland at Carleton University and Julie Bowker at the University of Buffalo examined people who actively choose solitude. They called these individuals unsociable, as opposed to socially withdrawn, and the distinction matters. Socially withdrawn individuals want connection but fear it. Unsociable individuals simply have a lower appetite for social input. And when researchers measured their mental health markers, the unsociable group showed no elevations in anxiety, depression, or social dysfunction. 0. Their brains simply do not generate the distress signal that loneliness-prone brains produce when social input decreases. Think of it this way. For someone prone to loneliness, being alone is like holding your breath underwater. There is a biological timer running, pressure building, a primal alarm demanding you surface for air. The longer the silence stretches, the more urgent the need becomes. Every minute that passes without a text, without a voice, without confirmation that someone out there remembers they exist, the pressure increases, and eventually they reach for the phone, not because they have something to say, but because the silence became unbearable. But for the people we are describing today, solitude is just breathing. The timer does not exist. There is no mounting pressure. Their biology stays regulated, whether the last conversation was 10 minutes ago or 10 hours ago. The silence does not build a charge. It does not accumulate into something threatening. It simply exists, like background temperature in a comfortable room. And that absent timer is not something they chose through willpower or mental discipline. You cannot train yourself out of loneliness by white-knuckling through Friday nights alone. This capacity was built, constructed through experiences that began earlier than anyone can consciously remember. And the way it was built tells us something fundamental about what humans actually need in order to become self-sustaining. The question that researchers spent decades untangling is how. How do some nervous systems develop this tolerance, this genuine comfort, while others cannot bear 15 minutes of silence without reaching for a screen? Winnicott's original theory contained a paradox that still surprises people when they first encounter it. He argued that the capacity to be alone develops in the presence of another person, not despite the presence of another person, because of it. Picture a young child on the floor of a living room. They are absorbed in something, building a tower, drawing, making up a story with small figures. The parent is there, maybe across the room, reading a book, folding laundry, cooking dinner, not hovering, not directing, not asking, "What are you doing?" every 30 seconds. Just present, available, if needed, but not intruding. The child looks up occasionally, sees the parent there, registers safety, and returns to their inner world. In those moments, repeated hundreds and hundreds of times across early childhood, something is being built inside that child's nervous system. They are learning, at the deepest biological level, that they can be alone without being abandoned. That solitude is not the precursor to danger, that their own mind is a safe enough place to spend time in, without needing constant external confirmation that they still exist. Over time, this becomes what attachment researchers call a secure internal working model, an unconscious template wired into the body that says, "I am held, I am safe. Even when no one is actively attending to me, I am not in danger." And that template becomes portable. It travels with them into adolescence, into adulthood, into every empty room they will ever sit in for the rest of their lives. This is why some people can live alone for years and feel genuinely content, not performing contentment for the people watching, not coping through distraction or denial, actually at ease in the quiet, because deep in their nervous system, below conscious thought, they carry an implicit sense that they are accompanied. The secure base that once existed as a physical person in the room has been internalized. It lives inside them now, available at all times, regardless of who else is or is not present. And that internalized security is what makes the silence feel safe rather than threatening. It is what allows the mind to wander freely rather than spiral into anxiety the moment external stimulation stops. Now, Edward, Desai and Richard Ryan's self-determination theory adds another dimension here. Their research at the University of Rochester identified 3 basic psychological needs that all humans share: competence, relatedness, and autonomy. That third one, autonomy, connects directly to solitude comfort. People who score high in autonomy orientation do not merely tolerate time alone. They physiologically require it. Their sense of self depends on having unstructured space to think, to make choices without input, to exist without performing for an audience. Take their solitude away, and they feel themselves slowly dissolving into other people's expectations. They lose track of what they actually want versus what they have been told to want. So what we are looking at is a convergence. Early secure attachment builds the nervous system's tolerance for solitude. Autonomy need determines how much solitude a person requires. And the default mode network provides the actual neurological reward when they get it. All 3 pieces fitting together to produce someone who can sit in silence and feel, not emptiness, but a quiet sense of completion that the extroverted world has never quite understood. But here is where this gets uncomfortable, because there is a version of all of this that looks identical on the outside, but comes from a completely different psychological origin. And confusing the two can keep someone stuck for years without understanding why. Attachment researchers draw a hard line between 2 types of people who report not feeling lonely. The first type, the one we have been describing, operates from secure attachment. They enjoy connection when it happens, and they enjoy solitude when it happens. Their independence is flexible. They move toward people without anxiety and away from people without guilt. The door opens in both directions with equal ease. The second type operates from avoidant attachment. On the surface, they look nearly identical. They spend significant time alone. They say they prefer it. They claim they do not need anyone. They appear self-sufficient, even impressively so. But the internal experience is completely different. Where the securely attached person experiences fullness in solitude, the avoidantly attached person often experiences numbness. Where the secure person can open the door to intimacy and genuinely welcome someone in, the avoidant keeps it closed because opening it triggers an old alarm. Not loneliness, something worse. Vulnerability. Dr. Amir Levine at Columbia University describes this pattern in his attachment research. The avoidant person built their independence not because early safety was present, but because it was absent. They learned before they could speak that needing people leads to disappointment, that reaching out results in being dropped. So they constructed a fortress around their emotional core and eventually called that fortress freedom. But the fortress is not freedom. It is protection. And inside it, there is often a quiet hunger they have systematically trained themselves not to feel. The way to distinguish these two patterns in yourself is deceptively simple. Ask one question. When someone I genuinely care about reaches out and wants to connect, what is my first internal response? Not my second response. Not the one I construct after thinking about it. The first one, the visceral one. If it is warmth, openness, a feeling of yes, I would enjoy that. You are likely operating from genuine security. Your solitude is chosen from a position of wholeness. But if it is a slight contraction, a recoil, an immediate mental scan for reasons to say no, then something else may be running underneath your preference for being alone. Not a flaw, not a judgment, just a different origin story that deserves honest examination. This distinction matters because the psychology of people who truly do not experience loneliness is never about avoidance. It is about having developed an internal foundation stable enough to rest on without anyone else holding it up. And the people who've actually built that foundation show up differently in every corner of their lives, in ways you might not expect. In 2018, Thuy-Vinh Nguyen, Richard Ryan, and Edward Decky published research in the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, examining what happens physiologically when people spend time alone by choice. Their findings were specific and consistent. Voluntary solitude reduces high arousal emotions, both the positive ones and the negative ones, while increasing what they called low arousal positive affect, calm, centeredness, quiet contentment, the emotional equivalent of a deep exhale after holding your breath. That state compounds over time. It is not a one-time effect. People who regularly access voluntary solitude build a baseline of emotional regulation that shows up across every other domain of their lives. They score consistently higher on measures of creative output, self-awareness, and what psychologists call identity clarity. That last term refers to the degree to which you know who you are without needing external feedback to confirm it. And identity clarity creates a cascade effect in relationships that is worth understanding directly. Research on adult romantic attachment shows that people with high identity clarity form healthier partnerships, not because they are better at performing love, but because they enter relationships from a place that already feels complete. Nobody is being asked to fill a void. Nobody is expected to make the silence bearable. The connection starts from surplus, not from scarcity. And that means they can tolerate disagreement without panicking. They can give space without it meaning rejection. They can say no without guilt and say yes without resentment. There is a paradox worth naming here. The people who need connection the least often do it the best, because nothing is being performed. No one's emotions are being managed to keep the peace. No abandonment cues are being scanned for in every sentence. What the other person gets instead is real presence. And genuine, undefended presence is one of the rarest things another human being can offer you. The same pattern appears in decision-making. Without the gravitational pull of what will others think, solitude-comfortable people filter choices through their own values rather than through social consensus. They tend to make slower, more deliberate decisions. Not from indecisiveness, from clarity. They have enough internal silence to actually hear their own judgment without 10 other opinions drowning it out. And creativity. Researchers have documented this repeatedly. The default mode network does its most sophisticated work during unstructured solitude. When you stop consuming input from others, your brain begins connecting ideas that seemed unrelated, replaying old problems from new angles, generating solutions that conversation could never produce because conversation requires performance, and performance interrupts the kind of loose, wandering thought that breakthroughs emerge from. This is why so many writers, scientists, and composers describe their key insights as arriving alone. Not in meetings, not in brainstorms, in the shower, on a walk, at 3 a.m. when no one else was watching. The brain requires silence to synthesize, and the people who do not fear that silence have uninterrupted access to their own creative machinery. There is another dimension to this that rarely gets discussed outside of clinical literature, and it has to do with emotional resilience during difficult periods. When life delivers a crisis, a job loss, a health scare, a relationship ending, the person who is comfortable with solitude has a resource that others do not. They can sit with their own distress without immediately needing to externalize it. They can process grief and confusion internally at their own pace without requiring another person to hold the container for them. This does not mean they refuse support. It means they are not destroyed by the absence of it. And in a world where support is not always available on demand, that kind of internal steadiness becomes a survival advantage. But none of this is a case for isolation. That would be the wrong lesson entirely. Nobody here is advocating for becoming a monk or a hermit. The distinction is subtler than that. These individuals simply have access to a source of inner engagement that requires no one else to activate. And that access changes how every single day feels when you are the one living it. Remember those participants in the University of Virginia study, the ones who chose electric shocks over silence. Their nervous systems were telling them something urgent, that being alone with their thoughts was an emergency, that the silence was threatening, and for their particular wiring, in that particular moment, it felt that way in their bodies. You know silence differently. You know it as the place where your thoughts finally slow down enough to be heard clearly, where your body stops rehearsing for an audience that is not there, where the version of you that exists underneath all the social calibration gets to surface and breathe without being watched. That capacity did not appear by accident, whether it was shaped by early experiences with a caregiver who gave you enough room to find yourself, or whether you constructed it deliberately across years of learning to be your own stable ground. It is real, measurable, documented across decades of peer-reviewed research, and it is a psychological resource that will continue serving you for as long as you carry it. You do not owe anyone an apology for the fact that silence feels like home. The friend who worries about you because you spent the weekend alone does not understand that you are not enduring those hours. You were choosing them. The co-worker who thinks you are distant because you eat lunch by yourself is reading your behavior through a lens that does not apply to you. And the part of you that occasionally wonders if they might be right, if maybe there is something wrong with preferring your own company, that part can finally relax, because the science is unambiguous. What you carry is not a symptom, it is a capacity. The people who do not get lonely are not missing a piece. They found something early, or they built it late, but either way they carry something inside them that functions like a home. Stable, warm, always there. And they do not need anyone else's presence to feel real inside it. That is not loneliness. That is not avoidance. That is one of the quietest forms of psychological freedom a person can know. If any of this described the way you move through the world, subscribe. I break down the hidden psychology behind how you actually work every single week.